This is the July 23rd, 2025 meeting of Overeaters Anonymous, 100-pounder meeting. And our guest speaker today is Geraldine O. Geraldine O came to OA in late October 2020. She's from Kilkenny, but has been living in Waterford since 2004. So, can someone help me unmute? I can't get to her.
I think I'm unmuted now.
Oh, there you are. Please
There I am.
speak, Geraldine.
Thanks, Laurie. Thanks so much for that lovely introduction. And hi, everyone. I'm Geraldine. I'm a gratefully recovered compulsive overeater. And yeah, very humbled and probably a bit nervous about being here. So thank you all for inviting me and to Rita for giving me this appropriate date. So yeah, thank you. So I suppose I know some of you, I know some I don't. So just I suppose to just give a little bit of background. As Laurie said, I came to OA in October 2020. And for me, what was it like when I think of that, what happened and what is it like now? Um, so I suppose for the 45 years before I got here, what was it like? And when I think about that, I think about it under three headings. What was it like physically? What was it like mentally? And what was it like spiritually? Um, and, physically, there was no doubt that I was a compulsive overeater. I was well over 300 pounds at the top weight that I knew of. I didn't weigh myself until I was following my plan for a little bit of time. So I had no doubt. But I suppose for years, I remember being on diets in my very, very early teens, and it was definitely a thing. In my household, it was always, a struggle about food and a struggle about weight. And, I had successes, with diets over the years. And obviously, diets work for people who aren't compulsive overeaters. But I suppose I now know that it wasn't just the physical aspects of the disease that manifested, but also mentally, I just couldn't stop myself from starting. So, I could have an old good run at a diet. And I probably characterize my, suppose, late teen to adult years as, sort of losing 4 stone, which say is about 60 pounds, and then gaining 6 stone, which was, 80 or 90 pounds. You do that often enough, and, you have, 150 to 200 pounds, of excess weight. And absolutely that happened. Um, Mentally, I just couldn't figure out what was wrong. On the outside, to anybody looking in, like things looked pretty good. By that stage, I had been married for about 15 years. I had three healthy children. I had had a nice upbringing, pretty regular Irish upbringing of the 70s and 80s. Um, with a few siblings, and all should have been good if I could only have mastered the weight. I had a good career, a successful job, didn't really have any normal day-to-day money worries. Spiritually, on the face of it again, probably for show, there I was, on the finance council of the local church, on the parish council. So, I was one of the priests, right-hand women, was there in church with the children decked out in their Sunday best, every weekend. And, I was probably in some black garb covering everything up. But I suppose I now know, the main part of the disease centered in my mind, and there's no doubt about that. And as I explore a lot, and what brought me to OA was, talking to my doctor and them saying maybe have a couple of therapy sessions that might sort you out. And after about 70 therapy sessions with the therapist who has recovery in a program, I finally decided, to come to OA. A couple of therapy sessions was never going to sort me. But what it did help me to realize, and about 6 months in, I did say to her, I'm addicted to food. I know I am. So without even knowing anything about OA, And she did mention the fact that OA existed, and I thought, oh, and that was pre-COVID, so I'm living in a good way from a face-to-face meeting, so I didn't do anything about it. And then COVID happened, and I was really worried because of my BMI. And again, I mentioned it to my therapist, and she sent me on the daily meeting list, and I didn't do anything about it. And then in October, I just said to her, I just can't see any real reason. Like, when you're in your 40s, there's no joy in life. You just kind of go through the motions, and that's how it's going to be until I die, and that's okay. And I could just see the look on her face that there was just no joy anymore, because even the joy in food had gone because I was so badly beaten by it. Um, and from that point, and that was the point at which I first felt the presence of some greater power, because she sent me on the Monday list of meetings, the one that goes out. And I thought she said to me, the contact person for, and she listed a specific group in Ireland, why don't you give her a ring? But she didn't say that. I got that idea in my head. I now know she doesn't know that person. She definitely, I've spoken to her about it since. And that person I phoned, and that person ended up becoming my sponsor and has been my sponsor since I've been in OA. So I now know that even from my very first interaction and going to my very first meeting, there was some higher being, there. So that's what I was like. I was crazy. I was doing all the things with food, hiding it, overeating it. If, I'd have said, no, I don't binge, but I actually didn't realize what I was doing. It was just constant eating. And, to steal somebody else's phrase, it just started, it was just all day. I had 3 or 4 breakfasts, 3 or 4 lunches. In those days of working from home for COVID, I stopped working in this office because even though I had kilos of food hidden around the office, I inevitably ran out. Whereas at least when I was in the kitchen, I was a bit closer to the food. So it was just all day, all day, all day. And like you don't get to be that kind of weight without an element of that, or I definitely didn't. So what happened? I went to my first OA meeting. I spoke to the person who became my sponsor, and they were reading the big book. I didn't really know why they were talking about alcoholics, and then, the person that I phoned who I said became my sponsor, I chatted to her, every day. She made recommendations around meetings that I could listen to, recorded meetings that I could listen to that spoke about abstinence, what it meant, spoke about the double whammy, the disease of the mind. And while I was listening to those, I was writing down, and in those first meetings, the tears were just streaming down my eyes because I think I knew there was something different happening, that this was a little bit different. Um, and within days, I put a food plan together. I just used one of the OA ones I identified. And I think I was lucky, I think, for me, because when the therapist spoke to me about OA and told, I kind of got the whole, oh, yes, I'm addicted to sugar, so I can't eat that. But it was very much like for a few weeks, all was grand. It was just doing it my own way, but it was just obvious sugar, and that was fine for a while. But I now realize I was triggering the allergy all the time. Like there were other ingredients that were an issue for me, and volume was a huge issue as well. And I had done nothing about that. So I think when I listened to the podcast on entire abstinence, and I understood that the abstinence for me was going to be easier, and I think I've been lucky that, I've had it framed, and the volume, you know, um, boundaries around that from the start. So that helped. But the food is just a bit of it, and Rita, you can share the photos if you like. That's physically what happened. I ate that food plan. I'm pretty much eating that food plan with 1 or 2 minor tweaks, for coming up on 5 years now. So that's helped with the physical recovery. So the photos that Rita has shared, the top two were taken in 2020, very shortly before I came to OA. And you can see in both of them, I'm dressed in black with some sort of thing in the way to try and camouflage what's going on. The bottom four then have been taken in 23, 24, and 2025. And I'm pretty much the same same size since then. So it took about 2.5 to 3 years for the £150 roughly to leave. Just eating that plan, it was sort of slow and steady. It wasn't a diet. I didn't even weigh myself while I was working the steps because I wanted to be immersed in the program. And now it's only something that I do on a monthly basis. But what's different, it's not just that I've stopped wearing black. You can see there's a variety of colours there, reds and pinks and navies and creams and whatever. Um, but what I noticed was, physically as the weight fell down, I didn't want to wear the black things I had in my wardrobe because internally it stopped being about, you know, camouflage and dark clothes, and I became more comfortable in my being. Like in one of those photos that was taken on holidays last week, my daughter and I are sitting on a kind of a lit up sort of thing in Croatia. I wouldn't have been able to sit down on the ground anywhere. That didn't happen. I have three children. When they were younger, I was never able to get down on the ground with them. Going on a plane was like, can I lift up my belly to kind of get this, seatbelt around me. So, the physical side is there, but I suppose the bigger recovery and the most important part of it has been, the mental and the spiritual side. And what I've realized is that, I didn't have just a weight or a food problem. I had a life problem. And over the last few days, I suppose when I thought about sharing, and even this morning with my therapist, because like I said, she has recovery in another 12-step program, and I said to her, I was kind of tired and maybe even a bit demoralized after coming home from the holidays, and I had discussions with a couple of people about where I said, life is just as it is, and that is the reality. And I think in one of today's daily readings, it was like, life and recovery, there's still things happening that I'm disappointed about. Um, there are still things that, I can be a little bit sad about too. And some of those that could be work related. I've had a laptop issue that wasn't resolved. So I'm in the office every day. I'm annoyed and need to work a 10 step on that. Um, and yeah, there are definitely things. So it's not a case of, I know when I was talking to a fellow at the weekend, we were talking about recovery sometimes being boring and sometimes being a little grey. And I suppose that's the reality for me some days. And I obviously like grey because obviously you can see the colour behind me in this room is grey. And in talking to that fellow, I said my biggest problem and page 60 in the big book sums it up. The show doesn't come off the way I want it. So as an addict, or I don't like mediocre, I don't like average, I don't like insignificance, and every single resentment or fear that I have, they all come back to that underlying fear of being insignificant. If I don't, excel at something, I won't be seen. If I don't, if one of my children doesn't perform well at an activity or doesn't get picked for something, that caused me to be restless, irritable, and discontented. And today I still get those disappointments, whether it's at work, whether it's at home. I come home, they've all been here all day, and the house is in chaos, and that causes whatever it causes. So it's not that in recovery I go in, I go, hey guys, hope you all had a great day. Delighted to see the house in like a kit because I just really, really want to get round to spending my evening doing that. It doesn't, but I suppose what's different is, in the past, I stopped at the shop on the way home from work and filled up with all the foods to kind of bolster myself up to deal with the evening. Now I don't do that. I might have an outreach call, I might have a step 10 call, I might stop my working day, get into the car, do a step 10. And I remember, especially on Monday evenings, they were busy. I often had the same resentment and fear around how was I going to manage to get everything in that evening, all the different activities, dinner, my home meeting, how was I going to pack it all in? And and I did that 10 step on a regular basis, but it helped me to get there. I don't have to do it as frequently now because having spoken to my higher power and I suppose worked through the fact it doesn't have to be perfect. Maybe Monday evenings, maybe you'll have to leave things. And that has been, I suppose, one of the biggest changes, that acceptance of life on life's terms, and acceptance of the light and shade in life. So I have days that are great. I'm looking at my nightly review and I'm saying, this is great. I got loads of outreach calls in. I spoke to fellows. I was at a wonderful meeting. I listened to that recording and I have everything prepped for tomorrow. And I think, yep, I've aced it. And like the 14 or 15-year-old me at school would go, yes, you're getting an A star for that day. But it's actually the days where, things have been on top of me. I've had to kind of grab a meal, still within my food plan, not, a little bit more kind of rushed or thrown together, but it's the number one thing for me that I'm thinking program has to come first. And I mightn't have got in as many outreach calls as I might have liked to. Maybe some of my meditation was a little bit rushed, but I've done them all. And as part of my nightly review, I'm thinking, yeah, tomorrow I want to give this a bit more time. So I can see that, I have to work it, I need to work it. And some days I need the days like that to remind me why I have the other days and why I need them. Um, and that's been it. And for me, and I often in outreach calls say to people, let's open up that chapter. Acceptance is the answer. Because it is accepting that the day is as it is. And for me, step three is the one that I go back to and say, this is the one that has fundamentally changed my life. Because page 417 says acceptance is the answer to all my problems today, and the all is in italics. So no matter what it is, I need to accept it. When I am disturbed, it's because I find some person, place, thing, or situation, some fact of my life unacceptable to me. So today it's the fact that the old laptop didn't come back, the tax return didn't get filed, and the new laptop didn't arrive. I really didn't think that that would be the case before I left work today. So it's completely unacceptable to me, but I have to accept it. Whereas in the past, I'd have been raging about it, I'd have been in the food about it. But I am serene. And I came home and I took a bit of quiet time before this meeting because I now know the reason that this was the date was because it was the Wednesday after I returned from holidays, day three back at work. The tax deadline haven't been missed. And I suppose God is saying to me, it's okay. It's okay. You found a bit of a solution, and one of those things being filed a day late will be okay. But the one that couldn't be filed late, you've found a way to communicate with the authorities. It's not perfect, but it's okay. And nothing, absolutely nothing happens in God's world by mistake. And I've often read, my husband at the start was very skeptical about this. I mean, we'd had a lot of ding dongs over the years about the weight. Did I not care enough about the children? Did I care if I died of a heart attack? Did I not see what I was doing? I did, but I couldn't stop it. And at the start, I just texted him. I said, I've joined this thing. I can't even talk to you about it. You know, but he, I suppose, 5 years in, has seen this thing works. And even one of the days on holidays when I was a bit restless, he said to me, have you made any of your calls today? So he could see that I need that time and it's freely given. He knows that there's to be no interruptions during this meeting today. But you know what? I'm a bit more serene about that now. When the kids comes in, so what? They're big enough to know mom will be out, in an hour or whatever. And equally, about a year and a half into program, he had a big decision to make around work. And he just said to me, can you ask God what the right answer is? So that was proof to me that he could see that this thing works, and it really does. Um, and for me, what am I like now? Yeah, I can still have, some of those days where things are a bit crazy. But the big thing is I don't resort to food. I do think about my program, so from when I get up in the morning, having that little chat with God, there's a nice 15-minute step 11 check-in out of Cork, where they read, some of the big book, we say some of the prayers, we have some meditation, we reflect on the daily readings for the day. Some days I'm completely focused on it. Other days, depending on how ready everyone is for school, that can get a bit distracted. Um, I like to make a couple of outreach calls, usually one before I start work, one at lunchtime, maybe one after work. I'm usually on the Step 10 train as well. I like to listen to Vision for You meetings or recordings, work permitting if I can. And then I like to get to a couple of Zoom meetings during the week. And at night, when I'm usually getting tireder, and I'd say my nightly review is the one that I often say I could definitely do with improving on that. But that's generally how I intersperse, the OA program throughout my day, as well as, stopping and pausing. Um, because, I have to remind myself so many times that I'm not running the show. And I've often likened, when I'm off in a whirlwind, it's like I'm saying, okay, just say I was running this show. I'd be getting a pay rise every day, a promotion every day. There'd be a write up about my brilliance in the workplace. My house would always be immaculate. Nobody would ever come in when it wasn't in pristine condition. It's never in pristine condition. My children would all be doing all of their homework and they would be top of the class in every subject. They would be on the best team for every sport that they play in. They would get person of the match in every game. And I'm going, where am I going with this? Because I'm spiraling out of control. That's where it would be. And then I said to somebody, yeah, even if all of
That's
those,
20 minutes.
thanks so much, Kevin, even if all of those things happened, I would be unhappy with the media write-up about them. And so I've just realized that, I would never be able to write the show as I would want it. So Geraldine as the director and the script writer, it would just never work out. So I've decided I can have that way that just would never exist, or I can choose, as step 3 says, to make a decision to turn my will and my life over to the care of God as I understand Him. And I've been doing that and trying to do that for the last 5 years. And that is infinitely better than trying to do it my way. And that's where it is, when I read with my sponsor, um, the part of step 3 of, what usually happens, the show doesn't come off very well. He begins to think life doesn't treat him right and he decides to exert himself more. And I was like, that was me. Whereas if I can stop, pause, and surrender and say, God, I don't like this thing, but instead now of me asking God to say, oh, can you change this, that I get that? I say, I know that you have a plan. I know that right now I'm thinking, oh, I don't know if I really like this one that much, but I know in time I will come to accept it because 5 years of doing this and hindsight has taught me to go, God, last week I was really upset over that. But look, God could took care of that one. Or yeah, it mightn't have been the outcome that I wanted, but you know what? It's okay. I'm fine about it now. I'm accepting that. And there's some things I don't really know why they worked out the way they did. But a lot of it is remembering it's not just about me, that, there may be reasons that somebody else needed something more than I did. And I suppose that's the selflessness that comes with this program of realizing, it's not about wanting or getting what I want. It's about wanting what I have and accepting, that I have lots of good things in my life. And even last week when I was having a little bit of a meltdown on holidays, I kind of pulled myself together. I made an outreach call, had a bit of a cry, and then I went, out you go. Yeah, you weren't able to go down those slides a few years ago. There's no reason you can't go on the fairly simple one. You don't have to go on the enclosed one. And I just went out with my kids and I say they thought, gee, Mama's going on the slides. Gee, Mama's jumping into the water. All that tentatively and like a bit stupidly and going chin first instead of whatever. But you know what? They had a bit of fun with it. And I just went, yes, I felt the fear. I said to God, I'm afraid of jumping into this pool. There's no reason to be. I jumped in and I did it. And I'd encourage anybody with this program, jump in, take it one step at a time, one day at a time. I still have to do that. I can't be looking too far ahead. When the going is tough, I just say to God, whether it's at work or family, tell me the next thing to do like I'm the newbie in the office. And he goes, how about you do that? How about you do that one? How about you do that? And it's like he's holding my hand and I'm going, yeah. And it's just easier because sometimes I was biting off more than I could chew, both in food and whatever. So, yeah, I'm going to finish with that. Thanks so much to everybody for listening. And yeah, thanks. Bye.